Hey guys, so we're going to be talking about Persephone and all of her lore and all of that good jazz. So, due to her innocence and purity, she was often called Kore, or Kore, which meant maid, and spent a lot of time with Demeter. She was also a symbol of young vegetation prior to her meeting with Hades, and generally continues her role as a goddess of nature. And she shared a role with her mother Demeter as well. The main story, and a story I have told on the channel before, is of course her ultimate meeting with Hades. And Demeter really enjoyed the company of her daughter. But when Persephone turned 14, that was the age at which, she could start to marry. Eros saw to it that love would strike plenty of suitors. His arrows met the likes of Apollo and Ares, Hermes, and even Hephaestus. And all of the gods started to give offerings to the Kore. A prized lyre from Apollo, a necklace from Hephaestus, even armor from Ares. But Demeter didn't want a cripple to deflower her daughter, and so had a meeting with Astrius, the astrologer god, who's a pretty smart guy. He could make predictions just using the stars and the constellations and all of that sort of thing. So he predicted that Demeter would need to watch over her daughter and watch out for someone that would take her innocence and another that would steal her away. So Persephone was taken to Sicily and hidden in a cave that was guarded by dragons, which are sort of similar to dragons, I suppose you could say. They're like these not serpent, but lizard type things with wings. So very similar to dragons. And Persephone would spend her days weaving in the cave. Demeter then returned to her duties, assuming that no other god would reach her daughter. But she failed to realize that there was one god who would probably tap literally anything, that being Zeus. Now, the funny thing with Zeus actually doing that is the fact that Zeus was technically Persephone's father. And still, incest was wincest, so yes. What Zeus does is he transforms himself into one of the dragons, and whilst Persephone is, cleaning herself in some sort of river or waterfall, something like that, Zeus decides to, what, right there and then. So, as a result of that, Zagreus was born, and he was a son that was capable of spawning lightning bolts between his fingertips, which was a very prized thing, but we all know how this usually goes. Hera was not happy about any of that happening. Her rage in this case was more so compounded by the fact that Zeus actually sat the baby boy on his throne, and Zeus really took a liking to this child, and Hera just wasn't happy with any of that. First and foremost, she does some trickery to get rid of the boy's lightning powers, and then whilst the boy was defenseless, she had some titans tear him apart. Fortunately for the boy, though, he's saved, and, well, at least his heart is saved, and placed inside another one of Zeus's lovers. And so, yeah, in a sense, he's sort of revived, but unfortunately that story turns out to be another sad ending for the child. And, well, eventually the child does get to grow up and live as someone else is related to Dionysus, or is in fact Dionysus, depending on the story. But the point is, it's unfortunate for this child. So, sometime after this, Persephone was playing in some fields with her nymph friends and spied upon a particularly attractive flower. Now, this flower was strategically placed with the sole purpose of attracting Persephone to it. And Persephone just had to have this flower. So she tried to convince her nymph friends to leave the water and go grab it with her. But unfortunately, these are water nymphs, and should they have left the water, they would surely die, and they all knew this, so they didn't want to. So Persephone decides to go off and pick this flower, and she's struggling to pick it out of the ground, but she does eventually pull it up and uproot it, and then the ground underneath her opens up into this massive chasm, and she can hear the galloping hooves of horses drawing in a chariot, or pulling along a chariot. And Hades is of course the rider. He snatches up Persephone. One of the nymphs sees this and tries to rescue Persephone, but she's no match for Hades, and Hades abducts Persephone. Also, thanks to the fact that this nymph decided to leave the water, she ultimately ends up dying in her grief and becomes a certain river. Now, Demeter returns and she wants to know what's happened to her daughter, and she finds the nymphs crying, and eventually the nymphs calm down enough to tell Demeter what's happened. and she becomes furious with the nymphs because none of them tried to help her daughter. So she curses them and transforms them into sirens. She begins a bit of detective work and tries to find out the full story of what happened to her daughter. She travels for 9 days across the earth, torch in hand. She might even transform into a bird to try and survey the land better, and even transforms into a crone, an older woman, for a bit in part of the story. But ultimately, her quest brings her before Hecate, or Hecate meets up with her. And depending on the version of the story, Hecate is the one that actually informs her about what's going on. In other words, the nymphs aren't part of the story. Or Hecate just agrees to travel with her to Helios. And Helios is significant because he sees everything that's going on. He's always constantly watching over the earth. So Helios eventually tells Demeter what's gone on, what's exactly happened, and she's not happy. She's incredibly furious. And this is another point of the story that divulges into multiple paths. Either she becomes incredibly infuriated and refuses to allow harvest, crops, or plants and flowers to prosper naturally, or she travels to the underworld to plea and convince Hades to release her daughter. Either way, it ultimately falls upon Zeus to make a decision as to what needs to happen. And it's decided that Persephone needs to be returned to her mother. But before she's returned, Hades has Persephone eat pomegranate seeds. Because she's eaten food of the underworld, much like with Izanami, she's bound to that place and must return for parts of the year. So when Persephone does return to the underworld, Demeter is incredibly depressed, not very happy, and doesn't allow harvest. And this is usually winter and even autumn month. And you might be thinking, wouldn't Persephone, of course, be depressed and not wanting to actually return to the underworld? But no, she actually grows to like Hades and love Hades and stays in the underworld of her own free will whilst she's there eventually. So there's that. Some stories credit this to the pomegranate seeds, the food of the underworld, changing her mind. Others just say that she grows an attachment to Hades. So yeah. But there's a lot more stories involving Persephone than you might think. After all, she is the queen of the underworld in Greek mythology. But did you know that she was actually credited with the creation of mankind in one myth? Whilst crossing a known river, Persephone spied upon some clay and started to model it into a man, a human being. She actually had some strategy in this. She wasn't just randomly playing with clay like a kid would. She was genuinely trying to mold something with purpose. And Zeus just happens upon what she was doing, once she was finished. Persephone asks Zeus to breathe life into the figure. And Zeus does this. And then Persephone wants to name the figure, and Zeus denies that, absolutely, because Zeus is the one that breathed life into this thing, therefore he wants to take credit for its creation. And so they have a bit of a scuffle, an argument, and then Gaia comes along, and Gaia states that it was her mud, her clay, that was used to form this being, therefore she should be credited with naming it. And so now the three gods are sort of having this argument. Cronus has to intervene. Zeus, you're going to get a domain over this being in one area, and it's not actually specifically stated what, because the actual text as to what was stated as lost. So perhaps this was, say, the fate of human beings, or some sort of governance over them. That much is clear. And then Gaia gets more or less control over them whilst they are alive. Persephone gets a degree of control over them once they die. And that's how this is sort of figured out. In fact, in some myths, Persephone is just referenced solely as the queen of the underworld. There's not too much mention of her otherwise. So that doesn't necessarily mean in those myths that she's not the daughter of Demeter. It's not mentioned. As for what man would actually be called in this story, Cronus decided that as man was formed from humus, that they would be named Homo. So yeah. Now there is another myth in which Aphrodite and Persephone actually have a bit of a scuffle. See, there was this beautiful man called Adonis, and Aphrodite was just so infatuated by his beauty that she couldn't let anyone else have him. So she hid him away in a box and kept him hidden from all other gods. And for some reason thought that she could trust Persephone, of all goddesses, to not fall in love with him. She didn't tell Persephone exactly what she was giving Persephone. She just gave Persephone this box. And so Persephone, has this box for a while and then peeks inside of it and sees Adonis, this beautiful man, and decides that she's not giving the box back. So then they have a bit of a scuffle, a bit of an argument. And Zeus decides that 1/3 of Adonis's life he will spend with himself, doing whatever he wants. Another he will spend with Persephone, and the rest he will spend with Aphrodite. And supposedly this is how the year is broken up in Greek mythology. Or according to the Greeks, that's how Zeus breaks up the year. But if you're assuming that's just the extent to how jealous Persephone can get, you'd be wrong. There was actually another being that attracted Hades' attention, let's say, and once Persephone had to return to the earth, Hades grew lonely. So the nymph decided to, get busy and, because Hades went to the earth and sort of did a bit of exploring, discovered this nymph. The two sort of had a bit of an interaction. In some myths, Hades actually takes her to the underworld and does things in his own bed with her. But the thing that myth does is she starts to boast about the fact that she was with Hades and claims that she was a better lover and more attractive than Persephone. And you don't play around with that stuff around Greek goddesses, as I'm sure you've learned by now. So Persephone meets this nymph, transforms her into a flower, and in some variations of the myth, stomps on the flower, crushing it underfoot, and with every stomp that she does, a sweet, attractive aroma is created. In other versions of the myth, it's Demeter that actually decides to stomp on the flower. So, yeah, pretty ruffle. Don't want to get on the bad side of Persephone. Now, in the last myth I'll tell you, Theseus... Okay, so there is no last myth that I'll tell you. But, hey, that's a good portion for you for now, right? Right? Yeah, I'm gonna tell myself that it is. But thank you for making it this far. Of course, if you enjoyed, give that like button a bit of a tap. I'm sure you haven't done that in a while. And hey, if you're new, go ahead and subscribe for more. But till the next one, very good day, chaps. I've been Prime, and I'll see you in a few. Bye-bye.